So, Yinka, great to see you again.
Thank you, yes.
Cheers. Good to see you, mate. So, very, very excited for today, Yinka. I think today is a podcast that's been 10 years in the making on our relationship over the years that we've known each other. So by way of introduction, you are currently the lead technology architect at CFC, Underwriting, where you've been for a little over 4 years now. Is that right?
It is, yes.
Cool. So CFC, I mean, look, phenomenal story, obviously, as a business case, very successful insurance company, focusing particularly around cybersecurity and emerging risks, as I understand it. And I'm sure we'll get into a little bit about your role and the great work you're doing there momentarily. But prior to CFC, you were or have been had a very successful career in insurance within other companies like Hiscox and Exchanging, which I think is where we first met, actually.
It was,
clearly a wealth of experience to bring to bear today. So very keen to pick your brains and hear a little bit more about your perspective and, go from there. So but let's start at the beginning, I suppose, with you, your background, how you got into tech in the first place, if you'd be so kind, and then we'll go from there.
Wow, yeah, okay. I guess I got into tech when I was a very young child. I had an Amstrad CPC 464 when I was 6 years old, and I remember my mum going out and getting one of the computer magazines, as they were then, that had it had a text-based adventure that you could program in BASIC, and so I started programming. I mean, it really was just copying what was in the magazine at the time. And it started then, really, my love for technology. I graduated through an Amiga A500, doing a bit of assembler on that when I was a bit older. And it sort of snowballed from there. So at university, I ended up doing a 4-year degree in computer science, a year in the industry. I worked for a company called Holmes, affiliated with the government. I think they expected me to sit there and take some basic work and just get on with it, but I started innovating for them. So they would do things like produce a catalogue and print it out. They send it to a printers and they would deliver it to all these local authorities. So I came up with the idea of taking the original digital feed that they used to generate the catalogue and turning that into a touch-based interface that they could deploy into post offices across local authority areas and different wards. I remember sort of sitting there with I guess my boss at the time, the person that ran the office, and walking through. He was a very, very smart guy, and he saw the value in it and took it on, and they actually trialled it. Obviously then going back into university was quite a change. So I quite liked being able to develop something and get it in front of people. So obviously I had a traditional software development background, and then I jumped through different industries. So network infrastructure management, I worked for a company called Riversoft, run by Phil T, who I think owned and sold Tivoli, and then started Riversoft. And that was good fun. I worked with some incredibly intelligent people there. And from there, I actually tried out some, I left Riversoft and tried retail. So a completely different sector.
Conscious choice to move into retail, or just?
It was actually. I was very interested in their proposition. They had a notion of being able to count footfall coming into a store and then integrate with at the time electronic point of sale systems and start to try and give retailers a notion of sort of conversion rate and then sort of product placement and that sort of thing. Right. So each move was a conscious decision to expose myself to a different type of business. From there, I actually moved into doing some consulting, which exposed me to wholesale banking and then insurance. And then obviously onto exchanging. And there I worked in the general insurance software division. And I joined there at the point where I think the board were looking to sell off that part of the business because it wasn't being particularly profitable. Right. But we say we, because there were a lot of people that were involved in the effort. We turned that around, and it turned into a part of the business that was worth purportedly 300 million by the time I left and went to Hiscox. So we did a pretty good job, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. I think you can chalk that one down to a good job.
And by that time I was doing solution architecture. I think each move I wanted a bigger problem, a broader piece of the puzzle to try and put together. And so then it was a natural move to Hiscox, and then on to Lloyd's, onto the first blueprint. And then ultimately onto CFC. But I actually joined CFC as the software development manager. So it was quite a nice foray back into a different type of technology leadership. Architecture is very much a leadership type of role, but you're doing a lot more consulting, facilitating, stakeholder management in a very specific type of approach. Software development management is far more delivery focused.
Of course.
But also far more people focused if that's the approach you take, because you're working through others all the time rather than sitting there and coding yourself.
Yeah. Fantastic, great. Well, thank you for that as an overview, and it feels like your career has been obviously up until the point you were in insurance. Was there anything specifically about the insurance sector that sort of sparked your imagination and sort of has kept you within it over the last few years?
So I think the interesting thing for me was the contrast between, for example, Morgan Stanley, so financial services, and I didn't know that much about insurance until I landed at exchanging. So my initial role at exchanging was as a solution architect, going in and working with insurance companies where exchanging was implementing one of their general insurance software packages, and I worked with the person I ended up working with at Lloyd's, Steve Holdstock. He was working for Accenture at the time, and we built a friendship then, but there were a bunch of people working with Steve who knew quite a bit about insurance. They'd been there for a while implementing. And I started to fall in love, I think, with the complexity. It's quite easy to look at personal lines insurance, house insurance, car insurance. I'll hand over some money and hope that nothing bad happens, and that's it. But actually behind the scenes, there's quite a lot of complexity. There are quite a lot of complex business problems to be solved. And the interesting thing about insurance is it hasn't really changed that much in a couple of hundred years. And technology is starting to have an impact. But I think there's so much more that can be done. So much more that can be done. And I think now it's starting to get really exciting and really interesting.
Absolutely. I mean, historically, I guess a lot of insurance, look at the Lloyd's market, it's obviously, the whole story of where it came from. It's sort of steeped in heritage, isn't it, in tradition. And it's like you say, it's that sort of interjunction between technology and the sort of the heritage and how it comes together. But I would totally agree. I think the insurtech space has been one of the most interesting spaces in terms of just the scale of transformation and the scope of challenges that you've got of what technology can actually do for the business. So I can see how it's definitely kept your interest over the last few years. In CFC, I suppose, let's sort of go on to that. Particularly successful, almost sort of the poster child of actually what tech can do for an insurance business.
Absolutely.
It's a very technology-driven organisation. But tell us a little bit about your kind of journey with CFC so far, and why it's been just such a phenomenal success in the last few years.
I mean, CFC has been a successful company pretty much from the get-go. I mean, particularly the last sort of 10 or 15 years has been a really successful business. For me, joining as the software dev manager at the time, there were normally you could say 4 development teams, 4 Scrum teams, so about 16 developers in total, I think. And CFC was at the inflection point of really seizing the ability to digitally transact business. So everybody talks about portals and things, but there was a real push on let's get a proper business-to-business API, but the whole thing is integrated. And I guess the pivot to be really data-centric. CFC has probably the world's largest collection of claims data, cyber claims data, and so being able to actually start to use that data to do intelligent decision making and ease the underwriters' job, so that actually they can crank the handle more on business development and things like that, was really, really interesting and really attractive. And of course, I've been there for 4 years. We now have 13 Scrum teams. Wow. We've grown massively. There's a considerable data science element to everything that we do now. So we've got a cadre of data scientists and data engineers, and we really are moving towards far more zero touch business. But equally, we haven't gone down the path that I think many people go down, which is trying to change our customers' behaviour.
Okay.
Right, so lots of companies go down the path of saying, no, you must use our portal, you must use our form. We're saying, no, it's fine, you can transact business in whichever way you like, and we're just creating efficiencies through far more intelligent use of data behind the scenes. There's lots and lots of very clever things we do. Plus, we go beyond just, let's say, intelligent classic insurance processing. So we do, especially in the cyberspace, we do a lot of proactive, I'll call it claims mitigation, but that sounds like it's for our benefit. Yeah. It's actually for the benefit of our customers, because you get some sort of cyber incident happening. It's the business interruption that costs you. It costs you financially, it costs you reputationally. Yeah. So we do things such as we'll do outside-in scanning to identify vulnerabilities. I think we've identified vulnerabilities across about 15,000 of our customers and got those closed off. So actually protecting our customers before anything happens. Nice. We also consume threat intel feeds, and we build profiles of cyber criminal entities, and we use predictive analytics and heuristics to identify threat vectors and the likely cyber criminal activist. And then what we actually do is we proactively go after that particular threat vector, right, and we work with our customer to close that down. And there have been incidents. It's interesting. You remember the film Hackers, right?
Yeah.
So,
love that movie.
It's a brilliant film, but hacking doesn't look like that.
No, I bet.
Prodigy isn't playing, and it's not super action-packed. Yeah, but we have had incidents where our cyber threat analysis team have literally prevented an attack seconds before it took place.
Really?
Yeah. So it's really cool stuff. But it all happens behind the scenes. All our customers have is a mobile app. It's very, very cool. So that's why I love CFC, because we're really pushing the bounds, and obviously we're just going to keep going.
Yeah. Do you find being in tech that actually the fact it is cyber makes it an extra layer of interest for you as a technology professional?
Yes. You could say, for example, classic commercial insurance. Okay, cyber, and it's not the word cyber, but actually it's I think it's the opportunity it presents. Because there are so many things you can do. I think because it exists in the digital realm, you have access to more data, more mechanisms for doing interesting things. Yeah. But also then that's almost the vanguard for being disruptive in more classical areas. So for example, D&O or management liability, right? So could you consume a feed and then start understanding perhaps sentiment or predicting activity, so that you can then work with directors, for example, or companies to let them know that something is about to transpire, and therefore maybe go out, get set about mitigating that and helping them. So it's a vanguard for being able to be disruptive elsewhere, I think, which is so it's interesting because of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So you kind of mentioned earlier that you feel it's kind of, lots happened, and clearly, like I say, CFC doing some phenomenal work, but it's kind of just getting exciting now. So where do you feel, the future lies? What's sort of the next big thing, do you think?
I mean, when you look at the acceleration of technology, in terms of the adoption of it, the use of it, the misuse of it, the interesting thing is, I had a question the other day from somebody that they were saying, well, if somebody takes out a cyber policy and then a new piece of malware or a new threat develops after the policy's been written, are they protected for that? And the answer is, well, yes. What's the point of the policy? But of course, what that means is when you look at, if you look at generative AI, for example, now that presents a whole world of problems for, for copyright, legal problems, but also cyber, cybersecurity. You look at Web3, yes, okay, at the moment it's going through, I think, a natural point of inflection and maturation where it's a case, okay, it's meant to be distributed and democratized, so how can a centralized authority govern it or apply regulation? But something has to happen in order to actually allow that technology to flourish. But equally, then you look and go, okay, if it's completely distributed, that's a huge attack surface. But also, it's not, because it's meant to be super secure. So understanding that and then trying to equate it to something similar that has been insured before. So you may can perhaps provide insurance in that space,
Yeah.
I think is going to be quite an interesting journey for the insurance industry.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, just hearing that now is just super complex. Like I say, I guess the theme throughout all of your career has been the complexity of the problem and what you found very interesting. And yeah, but it'd be a super complex problem to solve. But yeah, food for thought. So interesting, you mentioned earlier about you kind of started as a dev manager, then moved back into technical architecture. When we obviously speak to candidates, very often we'll see this sort of quite well-trodden path of, starting as an engineer and then maybe moving into a technical architect role or a solutions architect role and then maybe moving into management and never necessarily going back the other way. But you've obviously taken that conscious decision, like I say, to maybe get more closer to the business. And to talk through a little bit about your thought process about, why you chose to go back into that space.
So I think, so for quite a bit of my career, I was a permanent member of staff. And so the notion of doing what's best for the business at times sat secondary to what's best for me. And I had the opportunity to go contracting. And obviously to go contracting, you start up your own business. And I still run businesses now. And I didn't realize how much freedom in terms of mindset and the entrepreneurial spirit that kind of flourishes when you're there handing your invoice in, but the reputation of your business is the most important thing. And sometimes you find you're doing what's best for the business, even though you really don't want to be sitting there at 11 p.m. sorting out invoices, making sure that actually you finished off the relevant piece of work for one of your clients. And I actually quite liked that mindset. And so I started trying to apply that to my everyday work. Obviously, I'm back in a permanent position, but I'll turn my hand to whichever role is most beneficial to the business at the time. And for CFC, it was software dev manager working with the CTO, Jonathan Fletcher. And for a couple of years, that was the most beneficial role I could perform. The first thing I set about doing was trying to understand the sort of design and architecture process that everybody went through, and I augmented and bolstered that. But obviously, as we started to build more teams, you get to a point where the conversation was, I can continue managing the developers, but we really need to get a bit further out in terms of architecture and really understanding where we're going, just making it a bit more concrete. And so the natural thing was to then move to that role and get somebody else in to pick up the software dev management side of things. Fair
enough. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And one of the things I've always been, give you a big head now, one of the things I've always been impressed with throughout our relationship was, that you are incredibly articulate, and I can, obviously very client facing, and I can see the skill of how you are able to interface between technical and non-technical stakeholders, and you just get it from a business point of view. You kind of see the bigger picture and the strategy, and you're very good at articulating that, which I think is a particularly strong skill for a technology leader. So is that a piece that you enjoy, the kind of the communication, the strategy, the articulation of tech to the business?
I do. The interesting thing there is and I won't be able to put my head out the door now, but the interesting thing there is that, message sent and message received are never the same. Each conversation, especially with, I'll say any stakeholder actually, because it works in all directions. You always walk away having learned something new about yourself, but also about the rest of the audience. I often find being a technology person and enjoying technology, if I get a bit impassioned, I'll get carried away and I'll dive off into the technical detail, and then I'll suddenly realise that I may have lost some of the more key stakeholders. And oftentimes there's an element of carrying too much, carrying too many assumptions into the room. I'm definitely guilty at times of assuming that, talking to a bunch of software engineers, they'll just get this because it's obviously this pattern X, Y, Z, and you start talking to them, and then you realize, oh dear, I've lost people. Yeah. So it's really about sort of seeing that and then going back and having another go, and that's what I really enjoy. And also when it goes well, that's a really good feeling.
Yes.
When you get a good outcome, because getting people aligned And oftentimes I think for technology leaders, that's the hardest thing, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to say, look, we're going over there. That sounds simple, but you have to say that in 8 different languages to, 16 different audiences. And most of the time, it's 50% of the time, if you get it right, you've done well. So I enjoy that aspect of the roles that I've held.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it transcends outside of technology alone, but winning hearts and minds and taking people on that journey. It's certainly a skill not to be underestimated as a leader. But let's talk a little bit about that and your leadership style. So throughout your career, you've been both a people leader, like I say, as a software development manager, but then also in a technical leadership capacity. So what do you feel, if you can kind of distill it down to its nuts and bolts, what do you feel are the most valuable traits of a great leader, technology leader?
So, I'd say empathy first, because if you can't empathize with the people you're leading, then you'll never be able to communicate well with them, because you won't understand what's important to them, because extrinsic motivation is easy, right? Here's a lovely big fat piece of, the pot of gold or whatever, and it's kind of like that's a carrot. But actually understanding what motivates people intrinsically and being able to explain why what we're doing is important, why we're moving in this direction, is, I think, key. It also elicits freer conversation, because people are then confident that they can talk to you about the things that are bothering them, or that they don't like something, which means you can help navigate those, navigate those waters, navigate those conversations more easily. Consistency, which is really hard. I
struggle with that one. I consistently struggle with consistency.
It's standing up and talking to a bunch of people. I do this sort of, I'll say normally once a month. We have a town hall. I'll probably get up there and talk about something. You have to pitch it to a level where an entire department, a crowd of 100 people can understand. And at times you might get a question. And the questions can vary, because you don't know what's going to come at you, right? And I would like to think that people feel they can ask me anything and I'll be balanced. But sometimes you get a question, you think, oh my God, what the? But then reacting to that means you're not being consistent, and you're not being honest with yourself, because the question you should ask yourself is, what do you really want? Where you really want to get to. So consistency is really important, and that's consistency in everything as well, in terms of if you need to have an influencing conversation with a senior stakeholder, then being consistent there is really key. And then I also think there's an element of, and I think it's a thing that I personally struggle with, which is discipline. Right, so it's different to consistency. Consistency is an outward thing, but discipline is an internal thing. I find this a lot. I still do side projects for myself, right? So one of my dreams is to write the most awesome space game, an epic space game, and I've started this 8 times, and each time I get to simulating procedurally generated planets and star systems, and I just go off down this rabbit hole of trying to do that. That will not add anything to the end. At the end product, I'll get stuck, right? So the discipline of saying, no, that's not what. So that's an example, right? So I think discipline is absolutely key for technology leaders. I've been quite lucky. The technology leaders that I've worked with and worked for, I think to a person, they've all exhibited a lot of those traits really well. Lots and lots of empathy, lots of emotional intelligence, lots of consistency, and incredible amounts of discipline.
Cool. I would totally agree. I think discipline is one of those things. I think I agree that consistency is an external thing, discipline is an internal thing, but they do get hand in hand, don't they, in many ways. And having that, we all go through those periods, I certainly do, peaks and troughs of weeks where you feel absolutely on it, really disciplined every day, you're doing the right things, and then you look back like 3 weeks later and you're like, Jesus, what happened there?
Yeah.
When did that die down? And I think the key thing about being a good leader is sort of creating that, irrespective of whatever's going on in the external world, whether things are going well, good, bad, or indifferent, it's still just consistently doing the right things and like I said, having the discipline to keep turning up and just keep moving forward, basically.
Yep.
I would agree with that, absolutely. Cool. So we've spoken a little bit about, you sort of mentioned earlier on about, the rise of ChatGPT, AI, large language models. What are you most excited about now as a technologist in terms of what are some of the kind of really exciting trends you're seeing in the market? And talk us through a little bit about that.
You're in beer now because I didn't say ChatGPT, you did.
Oh, really?
I said generative AI. I skirted that one nicely.
Oh, right. Okay. So I can do.
But yes, so I'll preface what I'm about to say with the technologies that have a broad social impact. I think are really interesting. Now, that doesn't mean to say that they are super revolutionary or they've got mass adoption yet or anything like that. But I think it's the technologies that have had a broad social impact. So I mentioned it before. I think Web3 and particularly crypto, even though at the moment it's in a bumpy spot, because of the social impact it's having in terms of people that perhaps didn't have access or to the ability to transact or to gain real wealth. Regardless of whether some people think some of it is snake oil or not, the bottom line is that I think crypto has had a significant social impact, and I think it's also having an impact, sort of in a let's say a corporate or capitalist sense, in terms of actually some of those institutions sort of doing a double take and wondering what they should be doing differently. And that doesn't mean to say that I'm some sort of anti-disestablishmentarian. I don't want to tear anything down, but I just think that's a really interesting technology. It will be interesting, I think, over the next sort of 6 to 18 months to see where it goes. I mean, I'm not whether the SEC's approach to trying to bring some regulation in is correct or not is not for me to say. But I think if some, perhaps if the Web3 community can come together and work out how they can bring in some regulation that is recognised to allow the technology to stabilise and then to flourish, I think something quite special can happen there.
Yeah.
So that's one, and I do think I think generative AI is the superhero and supervillain of the tech industry at the moment.
Absolutely.
There's a bit of hype. We at CFC we've been looking at a lot of this stuff, right? But I do think that you've seen examples of some of the text to image generation. Some of the firms get into a bit of spot of bother saying they plagiarized because they've trained their models on loads of stock photos they should have had access to, blah 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 blah. Yeah. But I think it's quite interesting because there are quite a few people when you talk about things like ChatGPT, they have my mum's like, what? What's that? Where have you been? But there is still it's kind of in tech, but it's not, because you can also see a lot of other people making use of that technology. Yeah. And I think there are definitely opportunities for people outside the technology industry to gain huge benefit from that technology. But equally, I think, much like Web3, crypto, there's a bit of, okay, ethically, what should we be doing here? Especially with the notion of people think it's almost like a computer program. It's deterministic, right? You ask it a question, it'll give you the same answer every single time. That's not true.
No, certainly not.
And I don't know if you heard the story of, I think it was a lawyer in the US who basically asked ChatGPT a bunch of questions, and it cited all of these cases, and he walked into the court and he delivered this material, and it had just been made up.
Hallucinated.
Yeah. So I think people not having an understanding that could happen and not using the tool appropriately could be damaging. But I think it's a really interesting, exciting space. And it feels like it's come out of nowhere, but we know it hasn't. It's been around for quite some time.
Yeah.
And again, things like dev tooling. So I used to play a tabletop role-play game called Shadowrun. It was really cool when I was a kid. I wouldn't play it now. But in that, they had a class of character called a Decker. So they would jack into the Matrix, some Wachowski siblings, the Wachowski siblings, yes. But they would then have these smart frames, which they would then basically ask to go off and do tasks for them, and they were quasi-intelligent. And you kind of go, it's kind of almost where we are. I mean, obviously we're not shoving needles into the back of our heads or anything like that and jacking into a matrix, but we're getting to the point where we almost have little digital robots that can intelligently go off and do tasks for us. And I think that's going to be really interesting from a software development perspective, because then does that mean that software developers suddenly have to grapple with being delegators and bigger thinkers?
Yes.
Right, rather than focusing on the small, tiny task in front of them, because something will handle that for them.
Yeah.
So I think that's really interesting.
How do you feel? That's a really great point, because it's definitely a hot topic at the moment of, how these large language models and Gen AI is impacting the role of a software engineer in terms of day-to-day, how they do it, but also their future prospects. And, and obviously I had this conversation last night actually at a roundtable, and we were talking about, is there actually a case at the moment, if you're a startup kind of bootstrap business, to pay for a junior developer to be sat there when actually the output of a junior developer at this point in time, based on the level of experience, probably could quite easily be replicated using something like ChatGPT. It's only obviously at a certain level that you kind of develop those skills around, context, I suppose, when it's not the be all and end all. But how do you see the impact of Gen AI on the software engineering role, and what part do you think it will play moving forward?
So I find that really interesting. As a human race, we look to replace humans, whereas we do the work, but we don't focus on making the fruits of human labor better, right? So I would say you still need a junior developer sat there, right? But then what happens is the experienced developer who kind of gets how to get the generative side of things working really well, because let's be honest, if you delegate to, a coding LLM and you do it badly, you get a bad output. And actually, if you're a junior developer and you do it badly, you're going to spend ages trying to work out what's happened. In fact, you'd probably then be a net negative producing developer. So actually, I think you do need junior developers, and you do need you could have the coding LLM with an experienced developer cutting the path and showing that less experienced developer how to actually get the best out of it. Because really, it's kind of like, we'll have augmented developers, right?
Yeah.
So I would say coding LLMs are almost like sort of cyber prosthetics for developers, right? It should make them better, more efficient, able to grapple with bigger problems, right? So rather than sort of go, oh man, I've got to do all the scaffolding for this microservice, and then I've got to kind of sort out the data and blah, blah, blah. What they can say is, give me the scaffolding for the thing, and the LLM just goes off and starts building that stuff. Or, a developer writes the key business logic and effectively asks the LLM to knock up a set of behavioral tests that prove that logic is correct based on some requirements. Suddenly then what you've got is you've almost got a developer that's got 8 arms and 4 brains. And I think that's where we should be thinking, rather than how can we get rid of people?
Totally. Yeah, I totally agree. I think the mindset of ChatGPT is disrupting the system or ruining the system, I think is it's flawed, because at the end of the day we're not going to go backwards from this point, from where we are. This is the new norm, I guess, and we're all interfacing with this technology and working out how to best use it. But I do agree. I think that moving forward, the people that are best able to query it, work with it, and almost use it as a tool, like you say, to be able to take on actually bigger problems and kind of create those efficiencies, I think will be the ones that, it's akin to the everyone always talks about the industrial revolution, isn't it, when people used to go around and like smashing up all the machines in factories because they were worried that they were going to be out of a job. And it's exactly the same thing. I think you kind of fall into that mindset of, Jesus, there's certain industries out there, let's face it, where I probably would be a bit worried. Like if I was in law, for instance, like you said, and that was an example of somebody that clearly didn't do their due diligence. But generally speaking, when you look at actually what the sort of day-to-day duties of a solicitor or a lawyer would have been historically, is to have that knowledge and understand where to draw upon the right different cases to prove your point. And obviously ChatGPT literally can do all of that in a millisecond. But to your point of what you said about that guy who clearly hadn't done his due diligence, it's about what do you then do with that information, and still you need that context around it as to how you can apply it to the real world.
But again, if you think about the law perspective, right? So let's ignore the hallucination bit for a second, because I think we're looking at the technology in terms of its current form, which is, I think, still not as mature as it needs to be. But it's evolving all the time. Just like a developer, you could say, well, okay, if you've got a barrister who's trying to build a case, if there was an LLM that was effectively understanding the parameters of the case, the parameters of the argument, and then going and pulling that material together and actually structuring an argument to be refined by the barrister, that would be incredibly valuable because they do it really quickly, which means you might get higher quality, more powerful, more punchy arguments. The courtroom will be hilarious, I reckon. But, I think about it like that. It's the same as at the moment we think about Copilot for developers, and then they've got to ask it a question or they've got to write a comment and it goes and does a thing. But it could get to the point where actually you might have a particular LLM that's all about writing behavioral tests, another one that's all about structuring deployments, right? And they're running in the background, creating content that you can go and review later, rather than it being a thing where the engineer is having to inform it all the time. It's watching what you're doing and responding to it. It's like a partner, right? Yeah. So the technology is going to move in that direction, I think, where it starts to understand the behaviors. And in terms of it, and by that what I mean is you're typing stuff in, so that's all it's really seeing, but your behaviours, and it's responding to what you're doing and then trying to help.
Yes.
I think that's when it'll start to become really, really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree. I like your term, augmented developers. I think that's it's a very good way of describing it, and hopefully that's kind of where we all get to. But yeah, cool. Okay, well let's talk a bit about I guess your journey as a leader and, times when things have gone wrong. The lessons we all learn when we come against these challenges. So what would you say have been your kind of greatest challenges you've experienced as a tech leader, and how have you overcome those?
So I think the greatest challenges as a tech leader has nothing to do with technology. It's always people. And the interesting thing is individuals, if you're talking to somebody or dealing with them one-on-one, that's quite easy. And when I say easy, I mean easier, talk comparative. When you've got groups of people and it's hearts and minds and emotions are running high, that's when it's really, really difficult. As an example, quite a while back, I had a couple of teams. And they needed reconfiguring because the experience was imbalanced. It was only one team. The other team needed some of that experience. And like I said before, I walk into a room with assumptions, right? So I'm walking into this room thinking, well, this is obvious. I mean, nobody really cares, right? You're sitting in the same office. You're probably going to move 2 meters away. It's not going to be a big deal. And I kind of gave the team effectively the instructions, like, guys, we need blah, 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 we need to reconfigure, experience, balance, such and such. Do you want some help, or shall I just go away and leave you to it? And they went, oh, go away and leave us to it, it's fine. Came back after an hour, nothing. 2 hours later, came back, and they're all sitting around a table, and they'd done nothing. As in, they talked a lot, I think. I think they'd done a lot of talking. I think they'd got quite emotional about it. People working with their best mates, and it all felt like a family and all those things, which I failed to pick up on.
Right.
And even then walking into the room, I failed to pick up on it. And so I went, guys, okay, look, I'm just going to help you here. And I just reconfigured the teams. I went, there we go. And the avalanche of emotion was, in hindsight now, I look back at it and I think, oh, that was horrific. How could I do that to a bunch of people? They got upset, people were crying. Really? That's how bad it was. Oh, it was terrible, terrible. And I mean, obviously afterwards, I apologise. I was like, guys, I didn't realise that you were so, would get so emotional about this, and I didn't even deliver the "I'll help you" in a particularly kind way. So, oh Christ, after 3 hours, come on, guys, I'll just help you. Here we go, we're done. Right, move on. That was quite an eye opener, and I pay much more attention to, the temperature in the room and try and empathise with people way more, and ask questions before delivering context, to just try and understand where people are, because you can't really convey context if you're unaware of the vocabulary that you need to use in order to bring people along on that journey. Because if they're already emotional, nothing's going to go in. So yeah, that's an example of something going wrong. I've at times, as I said, because I love technology so much, I've got kind of really impassioned about a thing, and then structured a brilliant deck. I think this is going to be amazing, right? Senior stakeholders are going to love this, and after the first slide, I've lost them. It's just too detailed, too much tech. Right. I've got it. You could almost say that PowerPoint, well, basically, I could give that to a developer and then go develop it. That's terrible. That's not going to work, right? It's always about learning, but I think the hardest thing, the thing where the propensity for something to go wrong, it's always really around people and communication. In terms of, I guess, other examples, I once had this is quite a while back. I was sort of earlier in my career. I had a really great boss. And he sent out an email saying he wanted this thing to happen, and he's the boss. It's his, and I flicked off a response, a reply all, which basically means I'd kind of stood up and started having a debate with him in a public room. So all of the people that were behind me that I was leading, they could see the point of what I was trying to say, but actually probably a conversation for a closed room. Yeah, and of course what that did was that started a bit of the software engineers are absolutely behind Yinka. They want to do this. And then you've kind of got sort of some of the other business people saying, yeah, but that's crazy. And so suddenly you've got friction in the company, which is detracting from the pace and the value that we can deliver. So all of those things, you learn those things as you go along. I would say if anything can go wrong, it will go wrong. And for me, it usually does. So
yeah, but they're all learning curves, eh?
Well, that's. I mean, the thing is, if you blunder into something, which is absolutely okay as far as I'm concerned, it is then your responsibility to learn something from it. And then do your best to make sure it doesn't happen again. Yeah. Doesn't mean to say it won't, but at least you'll see it happening.
Yeah, there's that awareness.
It's quite interesting when you see somebody else going through that, and you can see that on their face they're thinking, "Oh no, it's happening again." So yeah, there we go.
Yeah, absolutely. I can resonate with a few though. Certainly the email thread. That's something I've learned a long time ago, is never deliver anything remotely emotional via an email, because we did an interesting exercise actually a while ago where sort of read out a series of sent a series of emails to different people in the business, and they all had to infer by the title of the email what they thought it was about, whether it was good, bad, were they in trouble, and so on and so forth. And they were quite generic, sort of emails, but it was unbelievable the difference in just the different perspective of those people and how they looked at those emails as what they internalised and what they took away from it. And from that onwards, I've never, ever tried to deliver anything, because I think that the written word can be so easily misinterpreted, in a passive aggressive or just downright aggressive way, even though you don't necessarily mean it. So I can fully empathise with that one. And the point that you made about the teams, I think, was also quite an interesting one as well. And do you think a part of that was also, as a leader, sometimes we can be a little bit sort of too deterministic and often give people the answer, because as a leader, again, we're sort of expected sometimes to know all the answers and just go, look, guys, this is the way you do it, and so on and so forth. Now, actually, I think it was something you said a while ago that stuck with me, that, as a leader, it's very important to over-communicate the vision, but under-communicate the tactics.
Yes.
And in that scenario, I guess that's a classic example of what you spoke about there, where you're sort of coming in and giving the answer, but actually there's a lot more value and power in them having the autonomy and coming up with a solution themselves.
And sometimes it's awareness, right? You can be impatient because, it doesn't matter whether you're a leader. There's going to be somebody that you report to, or that you're responsible towards. So you end up in a position where you might have some impatience, and actually the self-awareness to spot that and go, okay, I am really impatient here, but actually, I can't just walk in and say, right, build the bridge this way and build it tomorrow. Yeah. So there is a bit of that. I mean, back to the email thing. I have a 1 minute hold on any emails I send. That gives me an opportunity to go, no, that was wrong. I'm gonna withdraw that.
Abraham Lincoln did the same thing,
Yeah.
Obviously not in
emails. Yeah.
But I think that's a very wise thing. I actually have similarly introduced that. It's not a minute; it's about 10 seconds, but it's usually long enough for me to.
And also, then the 3 email rule. So if you send me an email, and I send you a reply, and it gets past the 1 minute hold, and then you send me another email that invites further conversation, then I'll just ping you and say, hey, let's have a chat on a phone call or a meeting.
Because it probably easier. Needs to be spoken about rather than
because that email ping pong. You know, eventually what will then happen is one of us will forward it to somebody else with probably a one-liner saying, FYI, can you just get this done? And that poor person that has to read through 47 emails to try and work out what it is they actually need to do.
That's a very good point, actually, just from a logic and sense point of view. I never thought about that, but it's a good shout. Cool, awesome. Well, Yinka, really, really enjoyed the chat today. As always, it's fantastic spending an hour chatting to you and hearing your thoughts and the pearls of wisdom that emanate from your mind. But I like to end every episode of the podcast with the same question, which you may or may not know by now. But essentially, it's what is, if there's one favourite piece of advice that you've had over the years that you've either had given to you or you've imparted on somebody else, what would that be for you?
So I worked with a guy quite a while ago. I was a junior software developer, and one of the things he spotted was, whilst I was pretty good at what I was doing, I would listen to requirements, to what needed to be done, and then I'd just jump on it and get it done. I get it done phenomenally quickly, but I wouldn't ask any questions. I'd assume that I understood what the other person was saying, hence the whole message sent, message received. And his advice to me was, listen, when somebody asks you to do something, they give you some requirements, whatever it is, it could sound really simple. Ask questions, and then when you think ask some more questions. Don't be annoying, obviously, but just try and unpack what it is the person's really trying to get at. What outcome do they want? Which is kind of the start of empathy. But that was the advice. Just keep asking questions. Be curious.
Brilliant. Yeah, and I totally agree with that. And again, I think that's a great piece of advice that transcends. It's certainly very applicable within recruitment. It's the first thing I would always. Everybody thinks, within any form of sales-based industry, it's about being articulate, having the gift of the gab, persuading people to do things. And I'm always like, no, it's totally the opposite. It's like, you sit there and listen because you can't sell or advise anybody on anything unless you fully understand the situation. So
100%.
Usually before you start speaking, I think there's probably about 4 or 5 other questions I need to ask you before I jump into things. And I totally would agree with you on that front. Awesome. Well, look, thank you very much for coming on. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
And no worries at all. And wish you all the very best with your future endeavours at CFC. I'm sure you guys will continue to go from strength to strength.
Thank you very much, Guy.
With you in the team. And look forward to speaking soon.
Awesome. Cheers, mate.
Bye for now.